Welcome to the 5th episode of the Michigan Sports Analytics Podcast. I'm your host, Jake Grossman. Let's get started. Today, we're going to be talking about a bunch of really interesting analytics topics with Ryan Brill here. We're going to go through first our stat of the week, which is going to be fourth down conversion probability, where he's done some really interesting research and is also a constant topic of debate every week. Then we're going to quickly hop into some recent news and talk about the Saints' decision to fire Dennis Allen. And then finally, we're going to talk about his new research that he just published at the Carnegie Mellon Sports Analytics Conference, which it covers the NFL draft curve and a new way of looking at it that I believe might have, be optimal. And I certainly am excited for you guys to hear all about it if you haven't read the paper. So Ryan, with all that, can you just maybe take a moment to introduce yourself and your background and all that? Yeah, thank you so much for coming on today.
Sure. Thank you for having me. What a blast. Background, I'm a fifth-year PhD student at Penn. And I guess my advisor's very hands-off, so he doesn't tell me what to do. I have to wake up every day and decide what to do, which means if you're going to work hard on self-motivation, you better like what you do. So for the last 4 years, I woke up and said, let's do statistics with sports because we love sports. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've seen you've done a ton of research with baseball as well, in addition to your football stuff. Have you always just been a lifelong sports fan?
I started being a football fan because of fantasy in 9th grade of high school. I'm actually not a baseball fan. I don't know if I should be revealing that publicly, but what happens is baseball and football have great public data. Basketball, I'm a big basketball fan, but the public data is not so good, so I haven't done anything with basketball.
No, that makes sense. I do some work in basketball analytics myself, and I've definitely had issues with data access and stuff beyond to the extent that we weren't before we got everything beyond paid for. It was trying to just piece things together was a bit of a nightmare. So I definitely agree with you there. Transitioning into our stat of the week conversation, you've done a lot of work in terms of fourth down probability and sort of maybe questioning some of the most common rhetoric there. But before we get into that, do you want to just maybe take a second and explain just how do fourth down conversion probability models work and looking at the different options?
Sure. So usually the main covariate would be yards to go. And a good model will adjust for offensive and defensive quality, but it's not like most models aren't very granular, like, take the qualities of every individual player on the field and, look at the specific play call. It's more just a base rate of yards to go, a summary number of offensive quality, a summary number of defensive quality, which I think Bill Belichick said it best on that little TikTok clip, but it's just like a base rate estimate. It doesn't always apply given the play call, but it's still on average probably pretty good. So
absolutely. And then I guess in terms of your research, taking sort of what was there, I think the most common, examples, and certainly the ones that you cited were the Ben Baldwin bot public model and then the ESPN analytics model. That also now, fortunately, I feel like has more. You get to see all their data there because they are now publishing all the decisions on the website. So I was curious, how do you what are sort of the most notable ways? If you could sort of summarize, maybe your model differed from theirs before we even get to the sort of issues of uncertainty and data completeness of data and other things.
Sure.
Like that.
So before uncertainty, I guess there's a few ways to estimate win probability. One would be a statistical or machine learning model, which sort of says, let's take the data set of all plays in the recent history of football, and let's just map the plays to the win-loss outcome of what happened in the game. So it's okay. That might not have been the best explanation, but let's explain what ESPN's doing. So ESPN first fits a play level model. So given the game state, what is the distribution on the outcome of the play, aka yards gained and time elapsed, and then using the play level distribution outcome, simulate the game. So ESPN is a simulator. The other approach, there's not play level simulation. It's just like a standard, machine learning first class. You just map the X to the Y, and Y is win-loss, I guess. And Baldwin's is that. And mine is also a version of that because it's much easier. And the people I know who have built simulators, let's see, I know two. One works for a hedge fund that is like selling his simulated win probabilities to casinos. That took him 8 months to build. My other friend took him 4 months to build a simulator, and he's betting, and he's making money. But basically, do I want to spend 4 months just making the simulator? Not really right now, but
No, it's certainly those simulators seem quite difficult to build, and like I guess sort of leading into that data conversation and building a simulator off of win probability. There are issues that I feel like when I was reading them, it was super interesting. It would be awesome if you could just maybe briefly explain sort of what you guys realized when you were sort of digging into the data and thinking about it more deeply, as opposed to like maybe on the game level versus play level, and how they're so related, and why that sort of changes what you're looking at.
Sure. So I think the difference between the machine learning and the simulated versions of win probability is it all has to do with the bias variance trade-off from machine learning. So basically, a machine learning model, assume you have all of the relevant covariates, which is not true, but assume you have most of the relevant covariates. A machine learning model will be lower bias and higher variance than a simulator. So what does that mean? It means if you had infinite data, you would get the correct win probability using machine learning, because it doesn't assume any functional form, and there's like the theorem, like the universal function approximation theorem, that basically says given enough data, you can capture the truth. But what's the problem is you have finite data, so it's high variance, which means there's going to be so much noise in this data set that the machine learning model will inevitably memorize a lot of the noise. That's
Right.
called overfitting. Now, with the simulator learns first from play level results. So if in the last 10 years, or in the last 15 years, let's say there's 500,000 plays, but 4,000 games. Now, the sample size of the simulator is exactly the number of plays, and all the plays are independent draws. So you have a higher sample size, which means in some sense you have lower variance because you have more data. So more data means you're going to memorize less noise. You're going to overfit less to noise because you have more data. Therefore, the simulator is lower variance, but it's higher bias. Why is that? That's because you are now, when you're building the simulator, you are now imposing a simplified version of the rules of football into your code. And all those little simplifications you make kind of add up. And that's biased because it's different from the truth.
Right.
Now, the real money question is, and the answer is known by gamblers, but the money question is, would you rather sacrifice variance for bias, or would you rather sacrifice bias for variance? In this case, you would rather have the simulator because those people are the ones making money on the bets.
Right. That does show you, and that tells you that I guess like when you get into the question of why, like you sort of I guess got to the title of analytics have some humility, is this idea of when you're working with these finite amounts of data, the level of confidence with which a prediction can be made. Confidence being, I know, a term that you didn't necessarily love in that context, but like necessarily the confidence that you can make the prediction in, it's variable depending on the frequency with which that situation has appeared, because otherwise it could very much just be extrapolating from noise because you're just not working with enough data otherwise to prevent that, right? It would be the way to crystallize that.
Yeah, that's correct. And a couple things to spring off is sports in general is a small data enterprise, and I think it needs to be sold and understood as a small data enterprise. Like when people say big data, they're talking about, ChatGPT is trained on the entire corpus of the internet, or these image classification algorithms is like, oh, it's trained on Google Images. And that's just a whole other order of magnitude larger. And the noise, like in something like win probability where you're getting binary ones and zeros, it's just ones and zeros, and you want like a 3 decimal precision thing. It's very noisy. So yes.
No, that makes sense. And like I remember when I was combing through that paper, it was there's obviously more data at like N in 10, if you will, because it's just you've seen more of those plays. But when you get down to some of these fourth down and odd distances or fourth down and long distances, especially, is like at that point just throw out the calculator on 4th and 12. Like that's not gonna be able to give you the information you need if it's a real decision to be made, is I guess the point I'm trying to make. Because
Sure.
you're at the point where that's there, how much data do you have for that to begin with? I guess, can you sort of maybe explain maybe what other sources of uncertainty interact with the ability to like confidently model, like beyond these sort of just like sample size one? Like, is there other things that are interacting with it that you thought were important?
So there's multiple sources of uncertainty. Some you can quantify, and others you really can't. I mean,
I love an unknown, but
exactly, an unknown. So, right. So the sample size, you can sort of quantify that. I think hidden variable bias is the big, what's the word? Knife in the throat or something. But basically, so when you say you want to adjust for team quality, like the biggest simplification is you got a single number. Let's say like even the point spread is a difference in team quality. Or my favorite example was like at the beginning of when Tom Brady was on the Bucs. I was always telling people like, oh, he just got divorced. He's sleeping like shit. That's why he's playing horribly. But put that in your model, or
right.
Like a lineman's missing for the day. I guess the point spread should adjust for that, but
you guys were also using team quality metrics as opposed to point spreads because you also had like the ability, you thought that better accounted for like, I guess like, well, team quality one in offense is more relevant to your ability to make the conversion than defense, which I thought was like an undersold conclusion that I'm probably going to reference in the future. But even beyond that point, like it's just also like probably more stable with respect to like relevant of the quarterback, and those team strength metrics is probably gonna be better captured than even the point spreads possibly. But I do think you're right. The point spreads are going to capture some of those like hidden variables of like things that are different that day. Weather probably also captured in there if you have like the total spread, like the total in there as well.
Right.
Like one of those things.
Actually, after finishing the whole paper, realized that the conversion probability model gets even better if you take the point spread and the over-under, and you can do the market-derived offensive and defensive qualities just by that. It's like a system of it's two equations, two unknowns, and you like.
And that's better than what's it called? And that's better than the team quality metrics, actually.
It's better than that whole customized thing that took me 2 months to make. Yeah. So I think because it has the updated information of the market.
No, that makes sense. Yeah, because that's sort of getting at the exact sort of like biases there that you're sort of trying to account for, but can't when you're sort of trying to do the general model, but the gambling markets have it. So yeah.
Right. So there's variables that are hidden that you'll never be able to put in, like how well Tom Brady slept. But there's variables that are hidden that you could put in if you had more data. But I just found like some of these variables, like roof type or weather, I just left them out because they kind of overfit.
That makes sense.
But they definitely matter. I mean, everyone sees those ice or rainy games, and Tua against the Chiefs, that one year just couldn't do anything. So
yeah, it's one of those things also where it's probably more material like at the extremes than on the base, but then like trying to fit something to the extremes. I mean, talk about overfitting. So it's that's like one of those tough. That's definitely one of those tough problems to handle. That's super interesting. Do you feel like? Do you feel like maybe like on 2-point conversions and other examples or penalties where we sort of have these similar decision frameworks in football? Do you feel like there's the same sort of issue of when models are being built for these decisions of overfitting, or do you feel like but do you think that there's maybe like less issue with either of those, or you can handle them separately for one reason or another?
Yeah, so it depends on the objective function being used. So if you're going to make like a mathematical framework for a decision using win probability,
right.
I guess what I found in my paper that was the win probability. So let me first explain on fourth down, how the fourth down math was kind of working is if you succeed on the field goal, there's a win probability. Or yeah, sorry. Every play after a fourth down is guaranteed to be a first down, right? If you succeed on a field goal or fail, it's a first down. Succeed on a go, fail on a go, it's a first down. And after you punt, it's a first down. So the math is in terms of first down win probability, because it's like, oh, probability you make field goal times first down win probability on the next play if you make the field goal. Plus.
Which is why 1st and 10 was so relevant, that there was significant amounts of data, because that's often the case when there's a first down afterwards.
So even if you just take the 1st and 10s, which is the most common type of play, the win probability on 1st and 10 is like the crux of a lot of these models, and that itself is so hard to estimate. And so it doesn't just apply to fourth downs. Like, all the lessons apply to any of these decisions that use win probability. So now, if you could somehow if you could somehow use a different objective function like expected points, I would even say in the early game, since there's so much to go, you could probably just use like an expected points thing instead of win probability, and the decision would be more known, because expected points is less uncertain than win probability because there's more data to it.
Right, and looking at things on the drive level early in the game just makes a lot more sense, because the rest of the game is so uncertain, and if you're going to get caught in all this noise, where if you feel like the EP model is less subject to those concerns as compared to the win probability model, then it does make a lot of statistical sense from a confidence perspective, and just from a base perspective of just like strip out the fact that we ever looked at win probability in the first place, and you might have originally arrived at that conclusion. So that totally checks out.
So that's one perspective. But now that I'm thinking about it, when I was playing around with like my win probability bot, there is a big factor of point spread being a huge factor early in the game. So in the sense that, like, if you're a huge underdog and you found yourself in a really good position to go up, if you're a huge underdog, you almost want that high variance, because if you're a 10-point underdog, you're probably going to lose anyway. But oh wait, now you found yourself in like a reasonable fourth down close to the end zone. Just swing for that variance and go for the touchdown. Whereas an expected points model wouldn't have that understanding of variance. So,
especially if you're a team with like a weak, like I'm just thinking like a team with like it's so matchup specific. Like, you're a team that struggles with run defense. You're playing a team with a really strong rushing offense, or you're just a quarterback that struggles in the obvious passing situations, and getting up earlier just gives you that sort of compounding benefit as well. And you can definitely see teams that are down, that are in close games early, or just early on in the game, that are not projected to win that game, justifying decisions. So yeah, I also remember that if I remember correctly, the original sort of models for these fourth down decisions were based on expected points, right? Back before the ESPN and Bed Baldwin sort of came out with what they have, right?
Yeah, it was just expected points and yard line. No other covariates.
So yeah, I mean, it seems like I feel like we could probably go back and forth on that for a bit, but I think it's one of those things where we've gotten to win probability, and we see why win probability, a bit like the machine learning simulation question, we see why win probability, if we had it perfectly, would give us everything we need in order to accurately quantify these situations, like you're saying about the team that's not projected to win the game early on. But once we run into all these issues of uncertainty with win probability, there might be times in the game where you could justify it with an EP model, whether that's earlier or later. I think both of us probably need to sit with a little bit longer and think about, but it's certainly an interesting question.
Yep.
Moving on to some of the recent news, I wanted to ask what you thought of the Saints' decision to fire Dennis Allen. The internet was all ablaze with that today, and it's whenever a coach gets fired midseason, everyone wants to share their take. So figured why not let you share yours.
Okay, just note, I haven't watched any Saints game this season, but I was looking at. So first of all, you're a defensive coach, and you're letting the Broncos score 33, and the Panthers just beat you, and the Buccaneers dropped 51. That's embarrassing. But also, the Saints scored 8 points against the Chargers, 10 against the Broncos, 13 against the Chiefs, and 12 against the Eagles. And you've got dudes. You've got Kamara. Derek Carr is fine. And I know there's been some so sad to see the Olave stuff. But, yeah, I think it's just – that's a winnable division. I'm fine with the firing. I'm fine with not firing. It's all just meh.
Yeah, I think that team isn't caught in such a long-term, like, just there's nothing that team can even do to get out of the position they're currently in beyond extending their current core, which means I don't know who you think you're hiring this offseason. And it'll be maybe a little bit will be like the Texans when they just their situation was so messed up they just needed to do a 1-year Dave Culley sort of placeholder hire just while they got everything in shape for their real hire for whoever wants to draft Arch Manning the following year with them. But we will see on all that. Their defense is. I was just looking up the EPA per play numbers. It's middle of the pack, 16th in EPA per play and 18th in success rate. But it's one of those things where it's Dennis Allen. I feel like the team is just I think he made up the worst coaching record of any head coach with like as many games coached as he does. Like he has not had success in either of his stints as a head coach really on any level. The most successful season, I think, actually being last year, possibly when they were 9-8. So I'm not sure I see what the plan was here.
Right. It's not like they're going to get someone that much better. It's more of just the situation. But I don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be the Saints or a Saints fan right now, but it will eventually get better. You have to imagine, though. I think Loomis, whether he gets to stick around, is going to be an interesting question. But I think the relationship there with the owner is probably more fundamental to what's going on than anything. So if Benson wants him to stay, he will stay.
Yeah, I just talked to this guy at the conference who worked for the Rockets for 4 years, and he left, and I was like, "Why'd you leave sports analytics?" And he said, I just didn't want to have to like suck up and play these games to get a billionaire to like me anymore. So
no, that's exactly, unfortunately, how it works inside a lot of NFL teams, and they're not run even like businesses that service sports teams, because at least those are run like real businesses. In a lot of cases, these sports teams are really, even if they have a staff and appearance of being run professionally, so much comes down to the whims of the person in charge. And not that that's not more broadly true across a lot of companies, but it feels more problematic in these cases because it's not really founded so much as bought.
Yes.
Moving on to the NFL draft curve research, I feel like there are a few places that like this could go, and there's a lot of pieces to these NFL draft curves in general. So maybe we just start, sort of at the most narrow and get more specific with your research, and then maybe get to some questions I had about what you thought about your findings and more like that. So
sure.
I think the easiest place to start would just be, how do traditional NFL draft curves work? Just on the simplest level, the ones that, are sort of most popularly seen. I think there's, sort of that core 4 or 5 of them that are always floating around.
Sure. So I think all of the traditional draft curves, traditional mathematical draft curves, have the same underlying methodology, except with a different outcome variable. So when I say outcome variable, it's you want to define what does it mean for a player to be good, how good was a player once he was drafted and played in the NFL? How good was he? What was the value of his performance in the NFL? And you want to measure performance value so that players of all positions are on the same scale, because you want to compare a linebacker to a quarterback to a D lineman, etc. Massey and Thaler did this like weird outcome variable where they mapped number of starts, number of Pro Bowls, and something else. They mapped it to salary, basically. There's like the Stewart approximate value thing. There's observed second contract salary. There's wins above replacement, and there's another one. There's a few other ones, but basically it's just salary or WAR are the two easiest ways to map player performance on the same scale across all positions.
And the idea with the curve is that you're sort of assigning this idea of, at this specific position, that at least prior to your research, the idea was sort of looking at the average outcome and using that before we even get to the concept of surplus value to inform what your what your sort of expected performance was from a player drafted at a given pick.
Yes. So all the traditional curves are expected value curves. So among players who were drafted at slot X, say the 65th pick, on average, what was the performance value of those players?
Right. And I guess in context of all that sort of previous research, what about it? What to you screamed, "Oh, there's something else here, like that needs to be built upon"?
Okay, so in truth, what happened is one of the authors of the Massey-Thaler paper from 2013, which came up with this methodology, he called me in February, and I guess it's lucky that he's a Penn professor and I'm a Penn student, so you could say I got lucky. He called me and he asked me to do a replication study to see if his analysis from 10 years ago still holds true today. So I took the recent data, 2013 2023, ran the replication, and lo and behold, wow, it holds almost exactly, looks the exact same. And he was like, great. Now I want to, he said, that's great. He wants to write a new paper that says, like, he's an economist. So he wants to write an economics paper that sort of says, look, GMs, our paper's been out for 10 years. Everyone knows these results, yet GMs haven't changed their draft trading behavior at all. They haven't learned. So this is some sort of like, what is the word? Psychological.
It's one of the cognitive biases that would show up that would have shown up in a Kahneman book. I guess Massey and Thaler did show up in Kahneman's books, but it's one of those. Yeah, exactly that. It's the classic social behavioral economic stuff that is super fun to read about for sure.
Exactly, it is fun to read. So yeah, he wanted to talk about the cognitive bias, and as soon as I heard that, I was like, or what if? So you're telling me that these guys, these teams, billions and billions, and it's the highest stakes, read your paper and didn't do anything, but they're dumb. And I was like, let me just double check that maybe they're not dumb. Maybe they are dumb, but what if they're not? Like, what could I be missing? And I was just like, and then I was thinking of the example of Caleb Williams in 2023 with the Bears. And in my head, I'm thinking there is zero way they could ever be optimal for them to trade out of this pick. Not zero way, but like any realistic trade they could get for this pick. If I am running the Bears right now, I am not trading down. No, there's nothing that you can say to get me to trade down. And just having that notion, I was like, all right, let me go fishing for something. Let me go searching for something. And I was like, okay, then why? If I'm so resolute that I will not trade down, why? Right? And that is when it sort of hit, is that you want to win the Super Bowl. Like, that's the whole point. I'm not trying to have a higher expected value of player performance. There's a huge difference between expected value and winning the Super Bowl is being the maximum, the number one team out of 32. You're trying to eclipse a threshold. So what that is talking about is variance. You need variance to get over the tail too. So that's how it happened.
No, I mean, my most previous podcast to this one with Tej, we were talking about how you can correlate your decisions in the NFL in order to boost the probability of like being in that right tail outcomes and we were talking about that in the context of this, because if you want to win a Super Bowl in the NFL, you need to be creating this variance so that you can hit the right tail outcomes. And one other way we talked about you could do that was just making decisions that have some level of correlation between them. But this is like sort of just hitting on that exact concept of you need to be focusing on the edge, on the sort of edge probability of how well this pick can turn out if you want to be making decisions that put you most likely to actually be reaching those edge outcomes.
Yeah. So actually, let me make one caveat. I'll say sometimes you want to play for variance and sometimes you want to play for EV, and it depends on your team's composition. But that'll come later, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. And it's definitely something I was thinking about when reading the paper, when we start thinking about windows, although I probably want to put that in heavy air quotes to the extent they're valid. And we'll get into the question of whether anything could be a reflection of those sorts of windows, principal agent issues that could show up. But first, before we get into any of that, maybe like how did you go about, like, maybe just briefly explain, like, evaluating this right tail probability? Like, what was your sort of maybe benchmarks, and statistically speaking, what was your way of going about it? Yeah.
Sure. So I thought, okay, you're the Bears. You want to win a Super Bowl. Let's try the simplest version of valuing a pick valuing eliteness in a pick is the probability that the pick is elite, or the probability that the performance value exceeds the threshold. Simplest version. So right, number one mantra of research is always start simple and build slowly. So simplest thing, right tail probability of eliteness. Okay, so you could do something like I don't know, a quantile regression, but I wanted something more general because I knew that I was going to like build upon the right tail probability. So I was like, first, let's fit the full density of performance outcome given draft slot. Or in other words, the density of second contract salary was the outcome I used given draft slot. So first, that's just like a 1D. It's a single dimensional Y and a single dimensional X, which means you can plot it. Number 2 rule of research: if you can plot it, plot it. So I plotted it, and I was like, oh, this looks exactly like a beta. So, first of all, the outcome Y, second contract salary as a percentage of the cap, is bounded by 0 and 1.
Right.
And if you plot the density of Y for different X variables, you'll see there's a big spike at 0 because a lot of the people just bust. They leave the league. And then for those who don't bust, there's kind of a hump for most people get paid like a little bit. And then there's a long right tail of people who get paid a lot. And then what I noticed is that as the draft progresses, or as the draft slot goes from 1 all the way to the end, the bust spike, or the spike at 0, gets higher and higher, and the tail gets smaller and smaller and smaller and goes inward. So I was like, okay, given draft slot, each density looks like a spike plus a beta, but the beta is going inward and the spike is going upward as draft progresses. So then I think, okay, what is the best way to capture that? It's a regression. So if you think about the spike going up and up, that's just like a simple logistic regression, basically, with a parameter that determines the rate by which the spike at 0 increases as the draft progresses.
Right.
And as for the beta tail getting smaller and smaller, and the beta curve, the density of performance getting closer and closer to 0 with the smaller tail as the draft progresses, that's also just a different type of regression called beta regression. So that gives the full density of performance given draft slot, and then given that, you can basically easily compute right tail probability given that. So
no, that makes sense. And if I remember correctly, the cutoff that you found that most directly tracked with NFL decision makers, sort of the trade history, the Weibull, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that curve. Weibull? Yeah, I was like 2 tries. I was 0 for 2 there. So, no, the Weibull curve, it sort of tracked most with a cutoff of 15% of the cap for the contracts, which I think you said was only 16 players in your database of contracts. I would have to assume the vast majority of them were quarterbacks.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, so it's one of those things that certainly when you start getting to it, they're certainly shooting for not just elite outcomes, but the most elite of outcomes.
Right.
And that sort of like gets at this, and that gets at this idea of the S curve, right? That you sort of were playing around with in terms of how you wanted to frame this sort of valuation that was so, I don't know, extreme in terms of what it was valuing in terms of these tail outcomes?
Yes, exactly. So if you think about right tail probability, so let's say Y equals performance value outcome equals second contract salary as a percentage of the cap. The right tail probability is saying, what's the probability that Y exceeds a threshold? Now, probability is equivalent to expected value of an indicator. So that equals expected value of 1 if Y exceeds threshold. And if you think about what that's saying is okay, so a player gets drafted at slot X, and then a few years later you observe the outcome Y, and we're giving the score of this player a 1 if he exceeded the threshold, and a 0 if he didn't. So what you're saying is it's a complete success if he's slightly better than, let's say, Kirk Cousins is the threshold. A complete success if you're slightly better than Kirk Cousins, and a complete failure if you're slightly worse. And that's just ridiculous because it's not discrete like that. You know, if you're slightly worse than Kirk Cousins, maybe you're still valuable, but you're going to be less valuable.
Right.
So if you think about this 1 if you're above Kirk Cousins, 0 if you're below Kirk Cousins, it looks like a staircase.
Like a little stepwise.
It's a step function.
Yeah.
And so I was like, let's just smooth it out with an S, basically, which says if you're below the threshold of Kirk Cousins, you're going to be slightly worse, and let's make it continuous with kind of a steep drop off. Because if you're going to be worse than Kirk Cousins, you're probably not going to win a Super Bowl, and it's going to like quickly fall off and then get to 0. So,
and that sort of is necessary, I guess, when quarterbacks are driving a lot of that stuff with eliteness, both and also with eliteness of outcomes. But if we think about just Super Bowls too, like it's not just like it's driving that way. It's driving that way for a very valid reason of how important quarterbacks are in football. But it makes sense that you have to do it that way because there are even quarterbacks that aren't necessarily very likely to lead you to a Super Bowl are still getting paid very large amounts of money with respect to the average player, and will be not paid necessarily that far off from a Kirk Cousins, and certainly more than another player who might be valued more by an NFL team too. And now I feel like we need to sort of bring in the surplus value conversation, because a lot of what you were showing was really valuable and interesting in terms of the extreme values of these higher picks. But once you sort of brought it back into the surplus value is where you sort of got into this idea of, Massey and Thaler, like the loser's curse. It might not be as real as we thought. At least with respect to quarterbacks, but we'll get into the positional value stuff in a second.
Right. So, okay. So the notion of surplus value is.
Oh yeah, explain it first, please. Yeah, before we just gloss over that.
Right. So, the outcome variable that I used is second contract salary, which is signed in free agency after the first contract. So it's a reflection of how good the player was during his first contract. So a player performs well in his first contract, but he's also paid a certain amount. Because it's his first contract, he's paid in general like pretty low and less than the performance he provides. So if you have a rookie who's paid cheaply, but he's like playing pretty well, you now have that performance, but you also have extra money you could spend on someone else. So we also want to so the notion of surplus is like an economics concept that it's basically how good were you above your cost, in the sense of how much extra money can we give to the rest of the team. And I guess surplus is good because you do want to account for that extra money. Like that's awesome. But also at the same time, if the guy's good, that's important too. So
it's one of those things that's interesting because it makes sense on like a base level, though I would think most rookie contract players who relatively hit and even get a second contract are probably surplus value on their rookie contract just due to how the scaling of that works. But even with that point, I think it's also, and maybe this is a good transition into some of the positional stuff, because surplus value on a first contract at the running back position is a little bit different than the quarterback position, both in terms of how important it is that you're getting that value on the first contract versus the fact that the player might be on your team for a second and third contract even is significantly more likely at, say, the quarterback position. And that makes you sort of maybe less cautious about the surplus value on the first contract and more just asking the question of, are we hitting this eliteness threshold? So that's a very interesting way to think about it too.
And now that I'm thinking about it, I feel like what people should be looking at is almost performance plus surplus, because let's say you draft a guy, he performs well, and that performance value means something to your team. But also, if you have a surplus, that's like extra money that goes to someone else. So you almost want performance plus surplus, which I've never even thought about before.
Well, yeah, it's an interesting idea if you could like sort of do I guess like the easiest way to do it would probably be like a PFF style wins above replacement thing, where you have like an objective performance grade that equals a dollar value. And then you could just sort of like, once you have performance equals dollars and sort of like a metric that for dollars, it isn't just the second contract value, I feel like would be the easiest way to sort of do that. But that's a very interesting, that's a very interesting way to go about that. That would sort of capture both pieces of that.
Right.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, that's cool. But to address the stuff. Okay, so all right. Let's say you're interested in an elite quarterback. Let's start with this. Then let's say you're interested in an elite quarterback, and for some reason you're an economist and you want like value over cost. Then you would ask, okay, what's the probability that surplus exceeds a threshold given draft slot? Okay. So that's thing one. And thing two to have in your head is, what was the surplus value curve before? It was an expected value curve. So on average, for players, for let's say quarterbacks drafted at a position, on average, what was their surplus? Okay. So for the traditional expected value surplus curve, there's this thing from the Massey-Taylor paper known as the loser's curse, which is the worst teams who pick at the very top of the draft receive less surplus value on average than better teams who pick later in the draft. Why is that? That's because those top picks cost a lot, and the cost declines very steeply. The cost declines more steeply than the average decline in surplus value.
Right. And that's sort of why you get these curves where the first pick looks similar in value to a pick at the end of the second or beginning of the third round.
Right.
And it seems like such a counterintuitive outcome for many who've, followed the draft and certainly the players available at each of those spots, and certainly the trades around the draft. And it never quite sat right with some people, but it was hard to argue with because it's surplus value, right? And until you sort of break it down this way of, okay, but what are the tails and how do we look at it by position? It's sort of, it's hard to argue with the economics of it. But I guess sort of looking at the positions of it, I feel like that sort of changed also this sort of question of, one, does the loser's curse exist? And then two, how should we sort of look at this once we sort of remember that quarterbacks are driving so much of this?
Right. So basically, if you're interested in an elite quarterback, you look at the probability that surplus exceeds a threshold given draft position. The loser's curse completely disappears. There's no hump. The top picks are the best. And the reason is those top picks have a real fat right tail. That's your Caleb Williams and your Peyton Manning and, I don't know, John Elway. And someone could say anecdotally, oh, like Brady was drafted at the end, Mahomes drafted at 10, but like those are outliers, right? So the fat right tail of top pick quarterbacks is so fat that it's enough to overcome the cost. Now, for non-quarterbacks, you still do see a loser's curse, even if you're looking for an elite non-quarterback. And the reason for that, I believe, is that the cost of a first contract is determined solely by draft position and not by player position. So the quarterbacks are priced the same as the non-quarterbacks according to what they're getting paid in the first contract. But it's
first 4 years. Okay. And I was like the 5th year option thing is like sitting there, and I was like, but yeah, it's so immaterial.
I ignored it. Yeah. I did ignore it.
No. It doesn't. It's not. It isn't material to the question though of the fact that like that 5th year scales, because it's slightly related to the positional value, but it's still going to be the same for any quarterback, frankly. So at least it's keeping itself constant that way. In a given year, right. I guess. Oh no, actually no, it won't be. I take that back. It's incentive based.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe it's incentive based. Actually, I don't want to. You know what? Ignore 5th year option.
I haven't thought through it. I'm sorry, but
no, forget I said anything. I was just it popped into my mind, and I was like, oh, it actually has one element. But
I think in the cost curve I made, it was just the first 4 years.
Yeah, but I think the years you did it off of, because if you were doing second contract, that means you didn't have a player who was signed. Most of the contracts should have been signed by
2019 or before.
Right, and then the second, then I think there's also the player performance escalator thing, which happens in one of the years, I believe, also based on other things. But these are frankly on the margins type stuff that shouldn't have material impacted any of the conclusions. I can't imagine that you put this data back in, you slightly edit everything for all of that, which frankly sounds painstaking, and anything changes.
Sure. I think the numbers might change, but not the shapes of the curves. So.
Right. That's if you were going to create an actual, if you were creating a draft curve with numbers that was to be adapted, might be worth going back and just sharpening up that. But other than that, I can't think of a reason based on the curves themselves, because none of the conclusions of the research would change.
Right. Okay, but
Yeah, sorry.
yeah, I guess ignoring the fifth year option, the first 4 years, it's true that it's kind of like that super steep cost curve for top picks. I guess like the far right tail of performance, which in this case is salary, the quarterbacks are making that far right tail of money and the far right tail of war. And the non quarterbacks, their tail is lower.
Right.
And when you have a lower tail and the cost is still high, then you're going to see a loser's curse as well. But now that I'm thinking about it, if we do this performance plus surplus thing, which I think is much better, I wonder if there would still be a loser's curse. So.
Well, yeah, because I wonder if the loser's curse. I mean, it depends because like even some of the positions that are somewhat devalued, like not all of them are necessarily strong first contract positions either. Like some of them are. Like when I think about like the secondary market, the running back market, the linebacker market. I don't know if that's necessarily an accurate statement because they don't. That's not always a position that comes to the NFL so ready. And then the edge market's one of those where they're usually also take a little bit to develop, and then it's really, and then like hit a little bit later too. So, but then all this stuff ends up being like once you started trying to model like the temporal aspect of all this, I feel like it can just get really,
Really
you're
tough.
probably losing more than you're getting by trying to fit any of that in.
It's so tough. Yeah.
I guess sort of hitting on something that we were because I feel like we've sort of gotten around like most of the key sort of concepts from the research. But before I sort of transition to just some things, I was wondering. I just wanted to give you a chance to like clarify anything that because I know I jumped in so many times to jump in with like different things. I was like, oh, what about? But yeah, was there anything that you wanted to clarify before I just jump in a couple questions?
I think one other interesting thing I found. So I tried to do 11 different position groups and separate curves for all of them. But the way that I made the draft curves, it was a Bayesian model, which means it comes with basically credible intervals or like, basically an uncertainty quantification. And when I plotted all of the 10 non-quarterback draft curves on top of each other with the credible intervals, I'm sorry, those are Bayesian versions of confidence intervals, but let's not
I
worry
was
about
gonna say no. That I feel like it's the like what I usually see on like when something's Bayesian and it just has like it's the shading. It's the what reflects
It's the
the degree of
shading.
uncertainty. Yes.
Yeah, but I guess the difference, we can talk about the difference between credible and confidence intervals too. It's pretty interesting, or it's just definitional. But basically, all those credible intervals were overlapping. So I was like, yeah, even though the running back line is like, and the linebacker line might be lower than, I don't remember if it was high, maybe the wide receiver line. Even though the lines are lower, the intervals are so wide and overlapping that I was like, let's just make it one line.
No, that makes sense. I mean, I was kind of wondering, like if you sort of did you think about using like different cutoffs for an elite outcome at those positions? Like that was the one thing I think I was thinking about when I was reading, whereas well, no running back or no one pretty much any position other than quarterback, receiver, edge is ever going to hit the other eliteness thing, or at least it's going to always not. I don't want to say no one's ever because I hate those kind of always generalizations, like firm conclusion type words. But it would be very unlikely for that to happen. So I guess the question was, did you think about that or look at that at all in terms of the idea of like using a position based cutoff for eliteness?
So this that needs to go in the conclusion of the paper, but basically I'm going to say something like, I'm just a stats guy. I'm not a football expert. So you have to have your football guy on your team basically say what is like the threshold of each position that we need to win, or that, and then you can use a different eliteness curve, I guess, for each such position. But you're absolutely right.
No, I mean, the question I was also just thinking about, I guess, in the context of the thresholds at all, was this idea of like thresholds with continuous variables sort of just being something that isn't you can necessarily just run into some trouble sometimes with that. And if there was like any way you thought about just doing like a more broad weighting, or if you found that it was important to sort of cut it off at a threshold because we were getting at this idea of tails.
I guess that's where I would say make an S curve for every position. And
right.
Like for quarterbacks, I would probably like make the leveling off point be somewhere around Dak or Kirk or something. But for other positions, yeah, I mean it's an art, and the reason it's an art and not a science here is because the thing you actually want, which is let's maximize the probability that your team wins at least one Super Bowl in the next 5 years.
I always struggle with the n number of years in that question, by the way. I sometimes say 7, I sometimes say 3. I always jump around because like realistically after n+2, everything's just going to be like relatively rounded minus who has an elite quarterback. We'll have a little bit slight bump.
Right.
Like so I always struggle with how I frame it because I try to frame every decision in terms of expected Super Bowls, and of course that requires a little bit of explanation, and it's just what does it mean it's 7 years out of your expected Super Bowls number? Like that should effectively be the same for almost every team unless you have like elite young quarterback.
And you're not going to be able to estimate that quantity at all in the near future.
No, it's just because it's pure uncertainty, frankly. Even n+2 is probably mostly uncertainty, right? Like
I think one day, n+2. I guess you could get this year's, like, you have all the rosters, and then I don't know, maybe one day when the player level bottom up models are so good that you can just like plug and play players and simulate drafts.
Because you could sort of simulate the free agencies and the trade thing, almost like kind of I think almost like how Madden works, where if like you like all that stuff can like actually be simulated out even in a real way multiple years out because you just have at least a close enough to, and like we said, it's never going to be every, but close enough to all the factors sort of accounted for.
Yeah. Maybe in a decade we'll see it. I don't know.
Yeah, and also frankly, if you try to do a position base, like I think about like the info you'll have, and it could just get really noisy, just because you have so few. You just have such like few data, for example, such little data of like a trade for players at each position comparatively than you do for trades at all the non-QB positions or all the QB positions, and sort of fitting that curve back. But I guess to the extent that you're trying to include player trades in the evaluation, which is probably one of the cleaner ways to sort of get at that quantification. I guess the one thing I also wanted to ask was just like, what other factors do you think impact like these decisions made by GMs? I know we sort of hinted earlier at like the principal agent stuff and how maybe that was tied in. If you do think there's some of that cognitive bias stuff going on, what do you think? Like, what do you think that would do to the curve if you found a way to like factor it in? I guess do you think it would shift? And that, like, would you think it would shift down to maybe n equals like 0.12? Like, do you think it's one of those things where it's about windows that, I don't know, like I'll let you run with the question, but I was just sort of thinking about that.
Wait, so the question is like, what else could be going on besides eliteness and math? Or
well, yeah, that's I guess what I was saying is like eliteness. Like I think like definitely like something that like I read the article and it was like preaching to the choir, and that is something like I definitely like sort of agree with. But then I was also thinking like, beyond eliteness, so there's definitely other factors going on in these decisions beyond as we mentioned earlier, the whims of owners, of course, playing a role as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure a big part of it is also like, some teams are still using the Jimmy Johnson curve, and maybe a better explanation of the paper is this is what Jimmy Johnson was getting at when he made his numbers. And maybe I shouldn't be speaking about like what GMs are doing because I can't. I don't know what's going on inside their head, but what Jimmy Johnson was doing, like, tell me a better story than this story.
Right.
I don't think you can, but.
No, and it's 32 teams also are 32 independent actors working with 32 different sets of information, as you said. And there are some teams that probably are acting with something close to the expected value curve that you're looking to sort of build on. And some are looking at something maybe similar to what you built here. Some are looking at something probably completely different that we haven't conceived of. And some are probably looking at the Jimmy Johnson model. And the average of all of those is spitting out what the league does, but it doesn't mean that they're a monolith all acting the same way. Right.
And actually, now that you mention it, two other interesting things. One is, if you think about which trades are happening, especially which trades down from the top, right? Like everyone who has a top pick and needs a quarterback is not trading down. Like, I guess the teams who are trading down don't. I guess that's not true with when the Bears traded down that one year, but it's almost like
they generally don't need the quarterback. Is what you're saying with the Bears, or what
it's almost like the trade curve, the trade market Weibull curve that sort of summarizes what the trades are happening is sort of biased by the fact that certain types of trades like dominate the trade market and other types of trades don't happen at all.
Yeah, that makes sense. Just due to like the availability of picks and how teams sort of deal with their accounting. Like teams are very willing to make a trade down in like the mid rounds of a draft, whereas certain other trades just because of like whether their player that they wanted is available or not. Like it gets really
Yeah. So there's a little bit of that. Oh, and the other interesting anecdote is an analytics guy on a team. I won't say the team, but it wasn't the owner, but I think it was the GM came up to him and was like, I don't want an average player. We never get an average player. I want a typical player for a draft curve. So he made median draft curves. So I thought that was interesting, but it's pretty different from the expected value. So.
Yeah, that is different. I also think that like the trade market, like Weibull curve is inherently incomplete because we only have access to the trades that were agreed to, and we don't have the negative of the trades that were offered but weren't to establish what wouldn't be reasonable within the market. And that's frankly, most of the volume is offered trades, not agreed to trades. So that's also just that bias too of like when we know there's an offered trade that one team accepts and one team rejects, are we supposed to take that also as an establishment of value on that? And that data is only available like in a real selection bias kind of way of what chooses to get reported by teams that want to like make themselves look good or make the other team look bad for rejecting a certain premise. Sorry, I know you got to go, so I have one last question for you. So because these curves, even with like an eliteness cutoff of 2% contract value, which, is sort of that medium player that we're talking about rather than maybe even the really elite one, it's much steeper than the traditional expected value curve. So how does this impact your view of mid-round and late-round picks just in general, and then also sort of in context of one another?
So a steeper draft curve means that those mid to late round picks are less valuable than previously considered by expected value curves. Right. By how much less valuable depends on so many factors, such as position and the specific players available in the year and the specific composition of your team and the specific goals of your team. But in general, I think it's sort of this. I feel like the same phenomenon as with what happened when I released my fourth down paper is sort of happening with this paper, in that, like, on a high level, the trajectory of the fourth down stuff is, before coaches are way too conservative and they're just like following tradition. And then the math comes and they're like, oh my God, this is a travesty. You have to go. And then I'm sort of saying like, yes, you do have to go, and they are being too conservative, but like you're being a little bit, overconfident. And so to analogize that to the draft curves, before it's like Jimmy Johnson, top picks are everything. And then the surplus value, Massey Daler stuff comes out and all these other curves, and people are like trade down, all the surplus value, let's gobble up those middle round value. And I'm sort of saying like, yes, you're right, but also let's moderate a little bit because there's a very good reason not to trade down. And the math does show it if you look at the right math.
That's great. I think it's draft curve analysts have some humility. What's it called? I just had to make that joke, but I really do think that's fair. I think that's right in terms of things. And I know you weren't the only one banging this drum, but you're the first person to put the math behind this claim. So in that way, I really appreciate it. And I think this was awesome. I know I got super excited when I saw this paper, and I just want to thank you so much for coming on today and talking it through with everyone, both this one and the fourth down conversion one, because you just do really interesting research that sort of makes us reorient our thinking about some of the analytics proverbs that we've come to embrace.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It was a blast. And I do love when people care about all this stuff, because none of my friends care, but no, I'm just kidding. But yeah, thanks so much.
No, thank you. And thank you for listening, everyone. This was the Michigan Sports Analytics Podcast, and we'll see you next week.